I'm Dan Pablocki. You are listening to Our First Fears, a podcast about gateway horror, past and present, with creators currently working in the genre. Today's chat is very special to me, and as I went through, editing and mixing the episode's audio, I could hear the nerves in my voice. I so wanted to get this one right. Apologies for any awkwardness, or should I say my usual awkwardness. I must give cheers to my guest, the author Lora Senf, for helping me express my true love and passion for this particular fear. John Bellairs' seminal work of horror fantasy for kids, The House with a Clock in Its Walls, from 1973. Illustrated by Gothic legend Edward Gorey. Together, Lora and I explore childhood memories of our early love for this work, how Bellairs inspired us to tell our own kinds of stories, why his books have sparked a modern cult following, and how writing horror for kids in particular is most definitely a very powerful, very real kind of magic. Lora Senf is the author of the brand new kid-lit horror classic, The Clackity, which was a finalist for the Bram Stoker Award this year. To be clear, I do not call The Clackity a classic lightly. It is a must for kids and adults both, who like their scares with heaps of heart and hope, and ghosts of serial killers, and living tattoos of birds, and witches, and quest narratives, and otherworldly hungry monsters that are hideous almost beyond description. And I hope that after listening to our talk, you'll go out and get a copy of The Clackity, now in paperback, before its sequel, The Nighthouse Keeper, comes out in just a couple weeks. Lora gets the gateway. She really does. And she's doing the good work of keeping it open. Now, turn down the lights, turn up the volume, and get ready to explore Our First Fears. Hello, Lora Senf.
Hello, Dan Pablocki. How are you?
I'm great. How are you doing?
I'm really excited to be here and have this conversation with you.
Like I said just before we started recording, I am so thrilled. I'm kind of beside myself with excitement to talk about The House with a Clock in Its Walls by John Bellairs. Before we get into all that, I just would like to see if you could give us a brief intro about yourself, your work, and maybe your relationship to the horror genre.
Sure. So again, my name's Lora Senf, and I have right now exactly one book out in the world, which is 20 less than you have out in the world, Dan. My debut came out last year. It's called The Clackity. It's the first of 3 books in what we're calling the Blight Harbor novels. The Clackity is really about a 12-year-old girl who's very brave but also very scared, and she finds herself on an adventure where she has to save her aunt from a creature called the Clackity. And we follow her into a very strange neighborhood in a very strange world. And then there will be 2 books following. The Nighthouse Keeper comes out this October, and sometime I think next fall we'll have The Loneliest Place, which will be the end of this particular arc. And then in January of 25, I have a young adult book coming out that's unrelated called The Losting Fountain. And that's a real departure from the Blight Harbor books. As far as my relationship to horror, I don't remember a time when I didn't love spooky stories. I started very young. My dad read Poe to me, read Poe's poetry to me instead of bedtime stories. And I fell in love. And soon found House with the Clock in Its Walls, and then not long after that found Stephen King, and I just never looked back. Horror fan from the go.
Well, I have to say, Clackity is one of my favorite books of any genre for any age of recent times. I already told you how much I love it, and I'm just so happy that you're here to be able to talk to me about your writing and that book and this book. And I can't say enough.
Dan, that means an awful lot, because I think you know that I'm a fan of yours. I consider you a friend, but I'm also a fan, and so that means a lot coming from you. Thank you.
Well, thank you, everybody. If you haven't read the Clackity yet, put it on your list and keep your eyes open for the follow-ups. I'm so excited for the Nighthouse Keeper. Second question I am asking to everybody is, other than House with a Clock in Its Walls, do you remember the first time you ever felt frightened?
Yes and no. I was and remain, but was a kid with a lot of anxiety about life, just about life. And I was a kid in the 80s, so we didn't talk about anxiety in kids. You were just kind of a weird kid, and people brushed it off as you being a weird kid. But I truly
Exactly.
was afraid of the world in so many ways. Was not afraid of scary stories. That was my safe place.
Yeah.
But the first time I remember the moment that I can remember being truly afraid, again, growing up in the 80s, I remember the Cold War. And and I
Mm-hmm.
didn't understand it, right? As like a kindergartner, I didn't understand what was happening. But I heard terms on the news like bomb disposal. And we kept hearing about the opposing forces. And I was convinced that the world was going to war again. I was convinced. And so convinced that I built a bomb shelter under my bed. I had a bedroom in the basement. And I had mason jars full of water. And I absconded with sleeves of soda crackers and had them lined up under my bed. And I was convinced that someday the day would come when I had to save my family. And
Wow.
so that's the first tangible fear that I can remember,
Yeah.
aside from just the general anxiety.
Yeah, yeah. It's interesting that you say that. Like, I think of doomsday preppers, right? This book kind of touches on that as well. So
It does.
it's kind of interesting that you say that. And I remember those Cold War fears growing up in the 80s
Mhm.
at the same, probably around the same time as you.
Mhm.
There was a TV movie that came out around then. Hold on. I have to Google this.
No, look it up. It sounds terrifying. While you're looking it up, I'll say I just saw Oppenheimer, and oh, it brought back a lot of those old, deeply repressed fears that I didn't realize were going to
Oh
pop
yeah.
back up as I was watching that film.
Oppenheimer, I feel like, is coming out of some kind of, if we think about pop culture in a way that reflects what we're dealing with right now, I think Oppenheimer is kind of a direct line towards a lot of the echoes from the 80s that
Hmm.
we've been feeling in our politics and our pop culture
Hmm.
right now. So it makes a lot of sense that that is a popular movie and is bringing up those fears again. But the one that I was talking about is called The Day After.
I don't
It
know
was
it.
with Jason Robards, I believe, was in it. And I remember my friends on the school bus talking about it. And in little kid speak,
Yeah.
one girl said something like, "I heard the day after is going to happen tomorrow."
Oh,
it's kind of,
oh,
it's kind of funny that she put it that way, but also like these were the things that were being told to us on
yeah,
the news
yeah.
and the fears that were being stoked by, who knows, the media, our parents, presidents,
Yep, yep.
governments, all that stuff. In terms of this book, when you're freaking out about the nuclear holocaust and all that stuff, like how did you come to find this John Bellairs book, The House with the Clock in Its Walls, which does have to do a little bit with doomsday and the end of the world?
So as a kid, I never linked those things, right? That my real world fears and the finding of this book. Truly, I just found it on the shelves of my school library. And I remember seeing the spine and being drawn in by the creepy lettering and just checked it out. I mean, it was nothing more than that. I found it at the library and checked it out, and that was it. I had done a little Nancy Drew before that. I had done things like that, so I kind of had leaned into mystery. But this was my first experience with gothic horror written for kids, and
Hmm.
that was it. I was absolutely hooked. Bellers became my
Yeah.
first favorite author, and this was my first favorite book.
I stole Figure in the Shadows, which is his second book for kids, off of my brother's bookshelf, and I read that first, not knowing that there was another book before it. So I came to The House with the Clock in Its Walls second.
Okay.
And yeah, I thought it was kind of interesting. I kind of liked Figure in the Shadows more. I
Hmm.
think it was scarier to
Hmm.
me,
Hmm.
but rereading this one recently, it was interesting to see the moments that really were solidified in my brain versus a lot of the book that was like, wait, how did I get through this? Or like, I'm not interested in historical naval warfare.
I know. And there's a lot of time spent on our Lewis's obsession with naval warfare.
For our listeners, anybody who's unfamiliar with the book, can you give a brief synopsis or a long synopsis? Just synopsize the house with a clock in its walls for the listeners.
Sure. So we have got young, I believe he's 10-year-old Louis Barnevelt. Very quickly, Bellairs dispatches with his parents. We find out on page 2 that he's been orphaned. There's been a terrible car accident. He's off to live with his strange Uncle Jonathan. He doesn't know Uncle Jonathan. He only knows him by reputation. And Uncle Jonathan does prove to be strange in the best sorts of ways. We quickly discover a wizard. Kind of sells himself as a bit of a parlor magician, but he's a wizard nonetheless. And he lives in a mansion, and it's all full of this kind of wonderful wish fulfillment, a child getting to live in a magical house. But not all is well in the house. There's a ticking in the walls, and as we go through the story, we realize that ticking is not benign. There's something very nefarious about that. And through the course of the story, our young character and his uncle and their neighbor, Mrs. Zimmerman, who's a wonderful character, kind of search for the source of that ticking. And so while this mystery is happening, at the same time, Lewis is having very typical childhood angst, trying to make friends. He's a kid that doesn't fit in very well. Befriends a bully, which doesn't work out very well for him. And
Tarby.
Tarby, yeah.
What a little POS.
Seriously, I wanted to read his character with more sympathy, and I just couldn't. Tarby's the worst. We meet Tarby, who we think might be a friend. He's not a friend. And by the end of the book, Lewis and Jonathan and Mrs. Zimmerman have defeated the two wizards who were kind of behind this ticking clock, which turns out to be a doomsday clock hidden in the walls. And it's done in a way that's very much the child gets to be the hero, and all is well until the next book. So that's a very simplified synopsis, but yeah. There are details in this story, kind of like the naval battles, that I don't really think need to be part of an overview of the story.
Yeah, I think that works. So I've read this book probably 20 times since my childhood. I picked it up again and again when I was a little kid. Uh-huh. And then as an adult, I pulled it out with the rest of my John Bellairs collection from my mom's basement. And as I was, preparing to write my very first scary book for kids, I was thinking about this book. I was thinking about the author and all that stuff. One thing that I noticed in this reread was that the book doesn't even really get scary until like halfway through.
No.
And once it kicks in, it is eerie and magical and kind of has an almost a fantasy novel feeling to it, rather than what would be considered horror by today's standards.
Right.
Like, how do you feel that holds up for an audience today? Or like, what are your thoughts about the horror only kicking in halfway through, sort of changing genres?
I thought about that. And, the book turned 50 this June. So it's...
Really?
Yeah. This year it's 50. And I think that's telling. I mean, it was written in 1973. So there are things the author does. This isn't quite your question, but I'll get there. There are things the author does that we would no longer do in kids' books. There are references to religion that are kind of, they're in a joking way. I mean, he takes on Catholicism and his Baptist aunts and really, really kind of lightly mocks them a little bit. There are references to our main character and his uncle's weight that I think wouldn't fly. Nor should they necessarily in today's middle grade stories. So there are things that didn't age well in these books. Again, it's 50 years old. And I agree. As I was reading this book and thinking about the pacing, I thought this probably wouldn't get published today. I really don't think it would make it through the obstacle course of beta readers and agents and editors and finally land on bookshelves because of the pacing and because Bellairs breaks so many what we think of as rules. The narrator is omniscient, sort of, every now and then we head hop from focusing on Lewis to suddenly we're in a conversation that Lewis is not aware of nor part of with Jonathan and Mrs. Zimmerman, and we get these little glimpses into what's happening there. And that's really not something you see so much today. It was truly, I think, Bellairs just telling the story the way he wanted to tell the story. I think it was effective, but I think, again, it stood out to me as being something that we just wouldn't see from our contemporary middle grade horror today. And certainly as far as the scary kicking in halfway through, I don't know that kids would have the patience for it. I
wonder why I did. I mean, obviously media and our attention spans and attention levels were different back then versus kids coming up now who have had many, many different iterations of technology. But
I'm going to restate what I said. I may be wrong. Maybe kids would have the patience for it. Gatekeepers wouldn't believe that kids would have the patience for it. And so I think that it would be less likely to land in the laps of kids today than it was when we were growing up. I do believe there are still kids that would very much read this and fall into this world, right? Because there's something really charming and rewarding as a kid, especially if you're a kid who is maybe a scared, anxious child, to have that kind of child as a hero. I mean, Lewis cries often. He's not a hero by the normal standards in any way, shape, or form. But
he's not Percy Jackson.
He's not Percy Jackson. He's a regular kid. And he's thrown into the most bizarre world. And in this beautiful way that I think only kids can do, he accepts it, right? Magic is presented to him and he's like, okay, cool. I'm there. And I think there's something in that kids would still respond to.
Yeah. I've heard people call this book like the proto Harry Potter for Gen X. No, there's not a magical school, but would you consider those Harry Potter books? I mean, I feel like marketing could have turned those Harry Potter books, if it was popular in the late 90s after the Goosebumps sort of fall off. If horror was a term that people were interested in the late 90s, would Harry Potter have been sort of termed horror for kids?
I think so. I really do. It's been a long while since I've read them. But there are certainly some very scary, dark elements in those books that I think would qualify them. I know, we like to say horror or horror adjacent. But certainly I think that may be the category they'd fall into today.
Yeah, because in this book, we've got Mrs. Zimmerman, the next door neighbor, who is a witch, and Jonathan is a warlock. They don't have necessarily magical powers that they've inherited, but they have done research. They've done the work.
They've literally gone to school for it.
Yes, Mrs. Zimmerman has a doctorate in magical arts or something like that. She's a doctor. She's lived in France. She's world-wise. I think that's another part that might be appealing to kids is like, oh, this could be a goal. If I do the work, I can get there too, just like Uncle Jonathan. Which sort of leads me into sort of another topic, which is that when I was a kid, Bellairs' writing style was so atmospheric and really developed this world that felt so real. Late 1940s, Michigan, New Zebedee. I wanted to live there. I wanted to explore the old houses and the roads with the Barnevelts. I wanted to be part of their journeys. I wanted to go through the scary things with them and come out on the other side and eat cookies and drink cocoa by the fire. Was that your experience too? I mean, I wanted to live in this world. It was like beyond rationality. I was like, I would dream about it.
So much. And I think you and I don't necessarily see eye to eye on this, and that's fine. I think that makes this more fun. But you've heard me talk about how I like a good dose of hope in my middle grade horror.
I do too. I mean, I really do.
And I think this book is full of it, right? I mean,
oh, absolutely.
Because it's a scary thing happens, but we're going to have cocoa and cookies. A scary thing happens, but we're going to play a game of poker. A scary thing happens, but the adults are there to take care of you. It was kind of this scary world that was comforting and beautiful, right? Just thinking about what this neighborhood would have looked like and what this home would have looked like, and the cemetery. I mean, it was the whole world was just so so attractive to a kid like me.
But Bellairs, now I keep saying his name Bellairs. I've always said his name Bellairs, and other people I know say Bellairs, and I don't know which it is. It's probably Bellairs. So please excuse me if I, throughout the rest of this conversation, just keep calling him what I've always called him.
I have the same problem. I've always wondered, is it Bellairs or Bellairs? And so I may say both during the course of this conversation, because truly, despite loving his work for most of my life, I'm not sure.
So talking about this world that Bellairs built, is based on his own upbringing in Marshall, Michigan. New Zebedee is basically a stand-in for that, as are a lot of his young characters. Now, he wrote 3 different series, starting with the Louis Barnevelt books with Uncle Jonathan and Mrs. Zimmerman, and then the Anthony Munday books with Mrs. Eels, and the Johnny Dixon books with Professor Childermass. Right. So it's always a kid sort of paired with an elderly person or an older family member. They were always just these comforting, rich relationships. Yep. So New Zebedee, based on Marshall, Michigan, and then Anthony Munday's books were set in Hoosac, Minnesota, and Johnny Dixon was in Dustin Heights, Massachusetts. And I know that Mr. Bellairs lived in Haverhill, Massachusetts. I can't remember which is the pronunciation, but if you don't live in Massachusetts, they will make fun of you if you say it wrong. So I know that. I know that for a fact, so I apologize, New Englanders. But in Marshall, Michigan, there was the Cronin House, which I'm just going to call him John because this Bellairs thing is freaking me out.
We can call him John. That's fine.
Yeah. So there's the Cronin House in Marshall, Michigan, which John used as the inspiration for the house with the clock in its walls. I have done a little bit of research and found out that so much of that town, it ends up in a lot of his books and other books. There's an actual American Museum of Magic in Marshall, Michigan. Down the street, there's another house called Honolulu House, which I think was featured in one of the later books that Brad Strickland, the author, sort of took over the series for him. Can you tell me, for your own writing, what in your own towns kind of inspired you?
Sure. And what I'll say, in addition to what you were saying before I answer that, is he wasn't even, John was not shy about kind of announcing when he was self-inserting as an author, as a character. We've got Uncle Jonathan. So John was John Anthony. We've got Anthony Munday. I mean, I think that he...
Johnny Dixon.
Johnny Dixon. I think that we've really got an author who put himself in as both the child and the adult in so many of these stories. I think he wore both hats. And frankly, I think I have done a bit of the same thing in my own work. So that really resonated with me, this read-through, that I see what you did there, because I do it too. As far as in my own town, frankly, there's not a lot in my own town. The inspiration for Blight Harbor, I always wanted it to be sort of my own Castle Rock, sort of my own New Zebedee. And I wanted it to be a town where wonderful things could happen and different stories could spin off out of that town. It wasn't until we were driving through Butte, Montana, that I had my first real location that became an important place in the Clackity. And my husband grew up in Butte, and he said, there's this place I've got to show you. You're going to love it, because he knows who I am. And it was this abandoned abattoir. And I'm like, the kids are in the car. And I said, stop.
Could it be
Mommy's
any
gonna
creepier?
I said, Mommy's going to go trespass. And so I got out of the car and took my phone and fell in love. I fell in love with this building. It's this beautiful 3-story wooden brick. Windows are gone. Stunning, creepy, perfect building. And on the back wall of this building, there are, for some reason, maybe, I don't know, 5 dozen birds. 5 dozen birds somebody has drawn on the back concrete wall of this building. And I left there thinking, this is a place that has to be in a story, and it has to be in my story, because I'll be damned if someone else is getting it before me. And that's truly where the abattoir, where we meet the Clackity and where we meet Bird, come from.
I love stories like that. I love like direct, you plucked it out of the world.
Yep.
And ran with it and took it and made something new.
And I'll tell you something similar happened for Nighthouse Keeper. we were again in Montana. Montana is very, I suppose, a place where story seeds get planted for me. We were driving through, and there's the Anaconda smokestack, which I got looking at it, and I thought, "Gosh, that tower! What is that? What could that tower be? If
What is it? What did it look like?
a lighthouse without a light on top."
Okay.
And I got thinking, if I could make it anything, what would I make it? And that's where the idea of the Nighthouse came from. And I thought, well, that's not a lighthouse; it's a Nighthouse. And what happened? What happened in a Nighthouse? And then we have a story. So I suppose my stories very much originate from place as much as anything else.
Oh, it sounds like it. It sounds like you are an observer of your world and allow that sort of to get your brain cogs moving and circling.
Very much.
I was for my first book, I wasn't so much inspired by place, but I was inspired by these books, this series that John wrote. When I went back to my mom's house and pulled all of my books out of the basement, I had the book club versions from elementary school, so they're all paperbacks, and I reread all of them because I started to have this idea about a kid who moves to this town where his favorite author used to live. Because, John Bellairs passed away in 1991.
91.
I think,
on my birthday in 91.
Oh my gosh, you're kidding. Wow, what a coincidence.
Mm-hmm.
It's got to mean something.
I've made it mean something, whether it does or not.
I pulled the books out of my mom's basement. I had this idea for this kid who moves to this town where his favorite author used to live. The idea that I was inserting myself into this story was like, what if I got to meet John Bellairs? What if I got to talk to him about his books and where they came from and all this stuff? So it was sort of like I started writing The Stone Child as like a wish fulfillment, and it became an homage. John Bellairs is sort of like the person who inspired me to start writing for kids. I do wonder what it would have been like to sit with him and chat with him. I've heard some stories that he wasn't an easy person to talk to. I've heard that when he got sick, he burned all of the things in his office that he didn't want anybody to see, which, I guess that's fair. If there's stuff, if you know that you've been published and you don't want people nosing around and stuff, I guess that makes sense. But in my version of where the kid gets to meet his favorite author, it sort of has more of a John Bellairs story feeling, where it's like comforting. Uncle Jonathan, let's hang out and teach me things, teach me magic,
Well, and I think you might be onto something about John Bellairs, because I've heard those stories as well. But I've also heard this. So I have a feeling this is speculation, right? This is speculation.
Yeah.
I have a feeling he was somebody that maybe was kinder and more available to children than he was adults, because there's a story about him giving his personal phone number to an auditorium full of kids. If you've ever got a question, call me, kind of thing. And then my understanding is that he adored fan mail from kids and responded to most or all of it. That really meant something to him. So I wonder if his sympathies didn't lie with kids and not so much the adults.
I would imagine it must have been because he's always writing about these sympathetic relationships between kids and adults, family members, family friends. And it seemed, if he is putting himself so clearly into the characters, then, and I love that about him. I love that about him.
He said, and I'm misquoting, but the point is about right. He said something to the effect of, I write what I write. I write scary books for kids because I've got the imagination of a 10-year-old. So I think he really probably understood those kids, and they kind of got him. That's the picture I have in my head anyway. And
I've heard that quote too, and I feel like I can relate. Maybe
Same.
Not 10 years old, maybe 12 years old for
Same.
me. I don't know if my imagination has really ever evolved past that. It's hard to admit, but I think it might be true.
Same. I mean, when I have twins and they're almost 10, and with the last book, the third Blight Harbor book, there were a couple spots where I thought, this isn't working. And instead of going to my beta readers and to my agent, I went to my kids and said, okay, guys, here's what I did. Here's the story. What's missing? And they're like, well, what about this? And what about that? And two of their ideas made it right into the book because, You know what, we were on the same wavelength. And they knew what I was trying to get to. And I don't know if an adult could have given me the same help that two almost 10-year-olds gave me.
Well, that's incredible. I don't have children myself. I have a niece and a nephew, and they're both 6 years old right now.
Uh-huh.
I love them dearly, and I'm looking forward to the time when I can share my own work with them and maybe do something similar to what you did with your kids. Ask them for help. Hey, is this working? What do you think about this?
And listen, my kids, they're never going to listen to this, right? They have some really bad ideas sometimes. They have ideas that I just say, oh, yeah, uh-huh. But then every now and then they say, what if, or what about, or why not? And I think, oh, okay, why not? Why not try that?
I mean, to be fair, Laura, I have a lot of really bad ideas too.
Oh,
so.
Same.
I usually keep them to myself, but sometimes they escape. I feel like we have to talk about Edward Gorey, the illustrator of The House with the Clock in Its Walls, and the cover illustrator for many of Bellairs' books. For listeners who I've spoken with some other people on this podcast about Edward Gorey a little bit, but for people who don't know his work, can you describe it? What kind of vibe it's giving?
How do you describe Edward Gorey's work? I mean,
at least in terms of this book.
Yeah. So he works in black and white for these books, for the interiors, and his art is very, I'm not an artist. I'm going to use the wrong terms. There's a lot of really tiny cross-hatching and almost pointillism and tiny detail to create texture and to create ambiance in his work. His pictures are not necessarily outright frightening, but they're so moody. They're so incredibly moody that they just build atmosphere in these books. I really think that his art, as I'm flipping through the copy I have on hand, his art stayed with me as much as Bellairs' words did after reading, to the point that as a young teenager, I walked into Hot Topic. And, I was that kid. I was a Hot Topic kid. And
hell yeah.
When I could afford it. And I see the Gashly Crumb Tinies sitting on a shelf. And you could have knocked me over because I didn't know what that book was, but I recognized the art immediately. And I bought that book that day because I was so thrilled that this my first favorite illustrator was out in the world and had done other things. And that's when my mind really opened to the fact that Edward Gorey had not just done these books. He had been an artist in his own right and had done countless
incredible artist, cartoonist, writer, theater set designer. He did Dracula, I think in the 70s with Frank Langella on Broadway. He has a bunch of very short books. You would think that they're children's books, but I don't think that they're children's books.
I don't think they are either.
They're so funny. They're so tongue-in-cheek. And I think that is what we are getting from these illustrations in The House with the Clock in Its Walls. They're commenting on a past, right? And that's what Bellairs was doing as well. So much of this book was almost an homage to the radio plays that he must have listened to when he was a little kid.
That's fair.
At least, and I think in some of the other series, Johnny Dixon maybe more so than Lewis. Lewis feels like a bookworm. Johnny was into the adventure, action, horror radio plays. And I feel like that's what Bellairs was doing. And I feel like Gorey gets that. And Gorey sort of was, in his own work, always looking back to the past, most specifically the Victorian era, where I think he's most famous for being the illustrator animator for the opening to PBS Mystery, with all of those kind of like gray, vast mansion, moors, vistas, fainting ladies, and men in, top hats and all that stuff. I love Edward Gorey so much. I actually ended up I have a tattoo of of the chapter header illustration for chapter 10, which is near the end of this book. And it's the illustration of a wizard skull wearing spectacles
That
with
is
just
so cool.
a few wisps of hair left. And my brother put that on me. He's a tattoo artist.
That is so
and
cool.
It's one of my favorite things I've got.
Did I ever tell you, this is off topic, but we talk about coming full circle sometimes. And so Bellairs, Gorey, my first favorite author-illustrator pairing, when we were looking for illustrator for the Clackity, I had been given a list of a short list of illustrators, and they were all brilliant. I was like, how do I even, what do I do here? And then I got to Alfredo Caceres' work, and I fell in love with it, with this kind of dark whimsy that's in his work. And so I started internet stalking him, because that's what you do. And lo and behold, he had done the Spanish language edition covers for some of John Bellairs' books.
Oh, wow.
And I said, this is it. It's meant to be. This is meant to be. And fortunately, he took the job, and he's stuck with me now. We're working together now. But
well, wouldn't it be cool if you two formed the kind of working relationship that Bellairs and Gorey had for so many years?
Yeah,
like, you see those pictures and you associate them with Lora Senf, or the other way around. That's so cool. I love that.
Yeah, it was just one of those neat moments, and I immediately emailed my editor and said, please, please let it be.
Yes. Yeah, I haven't had too many illustrations in the books that I've made. I had a similar experience with Tales to Keep You Up at Night and More Tales to Keep You Up at Night, where I was given a few illustrators to look at. I sort of handed the baton over to the designer because I trusted them, and Marie Bergeron ended up doing chapter header illustrations in a very similar manner to the way that Gorey did chapter header illustrations for The House with the Clock in Its Walls. And it was just such a thrill to be able to finally see a book that actually incorporated that kind of design element. That's talking about full circle. That sort of brought me back to my own childhood, seeing like, oh my gosh, I made something with somebody else and it looks like this, and it's so beautiful. Yep. Not that I don't think the other books that I've published are beautiful, because they are beautiful too. Not every children's book gets to have illustrations in it.
And Dan, I've got your book right here, and one of the things I wanted to tell you, either on or off camera, microphone, however you want to say it, is how gorgeous this book is. I mean, just as a physical object, it is so beautiful. Your latest, More Tales, it's so beautiful.
They did an amazing job. I'm blown away. Marie-Claire Cruz was the designer, and like I said, Marie Bergeron did the artwork. They totally got what I was doing. They just got it. Yep. So I couldn't be more pleased about that. Getting back to Gorey, I wanted to ask you if you had ever heard him talked about in terms of, he was sort of famous for having his enthusiasms. Have you ever heard of Gorey's enthusiasms?
I don't know if I've heard that term with him. Tell me.
But you know what I'm talking about, right? Like if you've seen his work, you know that he's into Victoriana. Yeah. He's into cats. He's got fur coat motifs, decor, design, housing design, architecture, mystery novels, statues, costumes, cemeteries, those sprawling moors, English estates, and then of course death, sometimes morbid and sometimes comical, and sometimes both of them sort of combined. I feel like another reason that Gorey works so well with Bellairs is that Bellairs also has enthusiasms, right? Can you tell the listeners like maybe what some of his enthusiasms might have been? I mean, I have my own ideas, but
let's see. He loves the ordinary child in an extraordinary situation. Be it magical or not. It's not always magical. Sometimes the situation turns out not to be paranormal. He loves, as we've discussed, the younger protagonist with an older family member, friend, guide of sorts. Somebody there to be with them. Let's see. There's.
I know.
Go ahead.
I've recognized he likes to use Latin a lot.
Oh yes.
Right. Like maybe as like the little kids are learning Latin in schools, or maybe it's something that they've overheard during Catholic Mass or whatever religion.
No, and you're right, because I mean, House of the Clock in Its Walls opens up with some of that, right? We've got Louis saying things that he is not even sure really mean all that much in the moment, but it's what he knows to say.
And we've talked about the naval battles and the histories, and there's some stuff that's just thrown in there that's just completely out of left field. I'm like, wow, he really needed to talk about that abbey and, from medieval England, and or some obscure thing or whatever. I think that adds so much charm to Bellairs' writing as well.
I agree.
And he does it in a way that is just peppered in there. So like, it's not going to throw a young reader off. It sort of balances well. I think for the most part, maybe the scene where he's going on and on about the naval battles, maybe not, but
yes, with the naval battles. So if you'll allow me, there's this beautiful moment, and I'm big on the idea of things are going to be okay at the end in a kid's story. They can get real scary, but they're going to be okay at the end. And I'm convinced this comes from Bellairs. I'm convinced that's not something that it came from my fandom of his. And so here we work in the naval battles and my love for that. And he does it by showing us that Lewis has a future. Lewis has,
oh my god, that moment. I never noticed that moment before, and I think you can read it right now.
I must have absorbed it, but
I don't remember this at all, and I was like, bonk.
Lewis was given
exploded.
A Christmas egg, and in the Christmas egg, he can see any battle in history. And so Bellairs goes on to say, when Lewis looked into the egg, he could see any battle in history. Not the battle as it really was, but as he wanted it to be. Though he didn't know it, the egg, like the balls in the tree, was capable of showing him scenes on other planets. But it was not until he was a grown-up man, working as an astronomer at Mount Palomar, that he was able to discover the property of the magic egg. So it's like in that one paragraph, he takes all of these things that he loves and just squishes them together. There's those naval battles. There's the promise that Lewis has a future.
Yes.
There's the promise that Lewis still believes in magic, which gives me chills because, damn it, adults give up on magic way too easily. And
you're giving me chills too. I love that. Yeah, I love that so much. In that one
paragraph, he gives us all of that. And I didn't pick up on it until this reading. And when I did, I bookmarked it and said, oh, that's maybe the most important paragraph in this book.
Yeah. I don't know how I missed that in the 20 readings I've done before this one. Like, I think I just wanted to get to the scary stuff. And it's fascinating to me that there's so much more to this book than just the scary stuff.
Yeah.
And I think if kids are still reading this, if it's still on library shelves, I think that's probably why, you know. So getting back to the enthusiasms, what are your enthusiasms, Laura?
Oh, I'll never write a book without a ghost. I don't think I'm capable of writing a book without a ghost. It's never going to happen.
I appreciate that.
I love to work in, you're always going to see kids on bikes in my stories in one way or another. That's just a favorite thing of mine. I love a building where one is not supposed to be. And that shows up in all of my work. So typically in my work, a house, there are plenty of haunted houses, but they're very, for the most part, benign. I think ghosts are mostly perfectly nice people. But there are plenty of buildings where one shouldn't be, where I, of course, insist that my young characters go to, because that's interesting and that's fun. And then kind of like we just saw in that passage, I sort of still believe in magic in a grown-up way, I suppose, but I sort of still believe in magic. And so I always have characters who don't have that moment of, oh, is this real? How could this be? And have to go through that 3 chapters of acceptance. In my world, magic just is, and it's fine, and we all know about it. Some of it's scary, and then we have to deal with that. But just the idea that magic's real, that's going to show up in all my work. How about you? Tell me about yours.
Oh my gosh. Oh God, I wasn't expecting you to ask me that, but I should have. Duh. I definitely am a huge fan of ghost stories. My enthusiasm. Somebody has a ghost story, whether or not I believe them, I want them to tell me about it.
Me too.
I love hearing about people's dreams. I have an enthusiasm for that. with a grain of salt, I'm interested in astrology.
Uh-huh.
I love puzzles and codes, anagrams. I love a secret reveal. Like I love a twist ending.
Oh,
And I guess that's a good start. I mean, I'm also intrigued by junk stores and old paintings
mhm.
done by, anonymous people, like weird stuff that you find on the street. Like
Yeah,
those are my
I
enthusiasms.
love
Like
it.
if it's junk and somebody didn't want it and it's beautiful, I will pick it up and I'll take it home.
I love
So
it.
I don't know. I love junk. Now, speaking about fandom, I think we can't have this conversation without talking about the enthusiasm that so many people our age, older, even a little bit younger, have for John Bellairs as a writer. And I don't know if you've ever gone to the website bellairsia.com.
I've been to it, but it's been a long time.
It's so beautiful and lovingly done. And what do you think it is about these books that has affected people of our age that has made them so like voraciously into John Bellairs? Like if you look at eBay
Hmm.
looking for hardcover
And I
first
have.
editions for this guy's books, you can't find, first of all, you can't find the first ones. They, at least in terms of his children's books, you can't find them. And if you do, they don't have a jacket. They don't have, they're beat up, and they're starting like a first edition House with a Clock in Its Walls with no cover starts at
Yep.
$100,
Yep.
online. Like, what is happening? What is this all about?
I don't know. I'm gonna ramble, and then we can pull it apart if we want, or ignore it if we want. He didn't talk down to kids, right? So as children, when we discovered these books, we were never talked down to. We were presented with, again, for the most part, very average kids in extraordinary situations who were never the capital H hero. They just kind of became the hero of their story and became the hero they were able to be. They became a version of a hero they were able to be, and I think we as kids could see ourselves in that. It was scary, but it was scary written for us, and I think that's powerful. I think that so many of us jumped to Stephen King at a very young age, but that wasn't written for us, even though we read it. This was written for us. This was told just for us. There's the wish fulfillment in his stories, again, and the comfort, and I think we responded to all of that. And I really love the way sometimes he spoke about the wisdom of children and maybe how adults had lost that wisdom. And one other quick little bit that I'll read
Hmm.
um, is this is early in the book, and it's Lewis really first encountering magic. Right, he's never really encountered magic before, and now he's facing it, and it's in the form of stained glass windows and a coat rack. And the passage goes, Lewis thought a lot about the stained glass windows and the coat rack. Were they magic? He believed in magic, even though he'd been taught not to. His father had spent one whole afternoon explaining to Lewis that ghosts were caused by X rays bouncing off distant planets. But Lewis was a stubborn boy, and besides, hadn't he seen Aladdin's lamp on the back of Jonathan's playing cards? He was convinced that magic was at the bottom of the mystery. So there, it's the wisdom of the child, right? The child believing that clearly this is magic, despite the fact that an adult had taken great pains to come up with a ridiculous explanation for why ghosts weren't real.
Hmm.
Our child
It's true.
still
Yeah.
says,
No.
listened and still walked away going, no, that was silly. I just think Belair spoke to us respectfully, and
Yeah.
I don't know. How about what do
Sort
you
of.
think?
I mean, it's sort of jumping off of what you just said and the ideas there. Like I think about the respect that Uncle Jonathan gives to Lewis, the main character in this book, and the way that they sort of defeat the evil wizards at the end. Jonathan's like, we can't use logic. You have to invent a game that we can
Yeah,
play that will allow us to find this thing that we need to find. And he says, Lewis, go up to your bedroom and make up the most ridiculous
yeah,
game you can think of. And I think, in terms of adults respecting the child's imagination, magical thinking, what Lewis comes up with is the key to solving the mystery. And I do think that that's part of it. I do think, a lot of other authors play in that sandbox as well. But I think the combination of the writing style, the coziness, the scariness, and the iconic covers that Gorey created has sort of given us as fans a reason to want to continue to look back at these books and at the time in our lives when we were reading those books. And I think what you just read is and what you just said is perfect.
And you know what? It might be as simple. There's a quote from him that he said, "I write about the things that I wished happened to me when I was a kid." And maybe it's that simple. He wrote the things that he as a child wanted to have happen, and maybe we as kids responded to it. Maybe we wanted the same things. And so he wrote his own, he rewrote his own childhood, and then we got to experience it as well.
And what better definition of magic could there be than that, right?
Absolutely.
Somebody who actually is able to give that experience to a young reader. I just wanted to finish up the conversation with you by asking, how does it feel being an author who is now capable of influencing readers in the way that John Bellairs influenced us?
I don't even know how to talk about it sometimes. Again, I'm one book into my career, right? Hopefully I've got lots more to come.
Pretty impressive book.
Well, thanks. But there is truly, really and truly nothing better than getting the letter in the mail or the email from the parent saying, this is my child's favorite book, or the young person writing and saying, I didn't like to read, but I love this book. And wow, what a privilege and what a gift to be able to do that. And, when I wanted to be an author from the time I knew an author was a thing you could be. That was always, and I gave up on it for a long, long time, for decades. I gave up on it and came back to it. And the very idea that I can look in the mirror and find 10-year-old me in there and say, we did it. We did it. I don't know. It's incredible.
That's awesome.
It's a real blessing for sure. A lot of hard work, right? I mean, we all know it's a lot of hard work.
Absolutely.
But it
doesn't just, you don't just snap your fingers, but here,
Gosh, what an honor though.
Here you are. Anyway, thank you so much for joining me in this conversation. I like I said, I was jittery. I was nervous. This is like one of my absolute favorite things ever. And I wasn't sure I was going to be able to talk about it in the right way. And I couldn't be more pleased. Thank you so much.
Thank you. This was wonderful. It was wonderful to revisit stories with someone who cares about them as much as I do. That was a gift. Thank you.
Thanks, Laura.
Many thanks to Lora Senf for joining me to chat about Bellairs. His name has already come up in multiple episodes of Our First Fears, and I was just so pleased to be able to dig deeper into his life and work with someone who is as big a fan as I am, and whose own work is pointing back at his influence even as she begins to create her own. Again, Laura's sequel to the Clackity, The Nighthouse Keeper, hits bookshelves on October 17th, 2023, just in time for Halloween. That title is so good, right? The Nighthouse Keeper? It's one that just makes you wonder. Anyone want to join me for a midnight release party? Please subscribe to Our First Fears wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you'd like, you can follow our social media at Our First Fears, one word, on the site formerly known as Twitter, as well as on Instagram. You can also reach out at ourfirstfears@gmail.com. If you do want to get in touch, let me know. What are your enthusiasms? Thanks again for your precious time. I'm Dan Poblocki, wishing you sweet dreams and pleasant nightmares.